Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. Your boa breeding trials have been going great and you've been seeing a lot of activity from your breeders. However, the time has come to separate them and give them some food. You went and you separated a pair that you thought wasn't mating. Turns out they were mating. Is this something to really worry about? Are you going to damage the organs of your male boa? Are you going to jeopardize your odds of breeding success? Well, those are the topics I'm going to talk about today. So this actually happened to me a couple times just over the last couple months. You know, I paired up my boas back in November and they've been going at it full steam for the last couple months, some pairs more than others. And generally speaking, I disturb my boas as little as possible when they're in breeding trials. I'm not constantly poking around them and trying to determine exactly what's going on or exactly how many times they've copulated or exactly when the female ovulates. My strategy, I put the male and the female together, close the cage and walk away, and I let nature take its course. You know, if I was a mating boa, last thing I would want is my owner constantly poking me around when I'm trying to get it on with my lovely snake girlfriend here. Anyway, so I don't do much as far as interfere with the boas. Sometimes you have to though. You know, sometimes you have to clean the cage out. You know, there might be some excreta or feces, or there's a lot of liquids that get sprayed all over the cage if you have a successful boa breeding trial. So sometimes you want to clean up. And of course, after a couple months, you're going to want to separate them and offer food. And I've noticed on social media, you always see pictures of people, of people's boas, and the tails are wrapped together, and the person says, oh, look, my boas are mating, and, you know, I'm going to have boa babies. Of course, you rarely see the actual babies from a lot of these people. But what's happening more often than the boas are actually copulating is the male is just trying to court with the female. The male will be wrapping his tail around the female's tail and holding it in place. Usually, it doesn't mean they're mating. Usually, the male is just waiting for his opportunity to mate. And so, often, you can just separate the animals and, you know, they're not actively mating. But once in a while they are mating. And it might be kind of hard to tell just by looking whether they're just courting or, you know, there's actual mating going on. So of course, if, you know, basic snake genitalia anatomy 101, the male has a paired structure called the hemipenes, which actually has two penises that are connected, and one of them is inserted into the cloaca of the female during mating. And if you haven't seen a hemipene before, you might be a little bit surprised at how it looks. It's rather unusual looking. It looks kind of like a long pink wormy structure, but it almost has this appearance like an internal organ, like an intestine. So if you just see this all of a sudden and you're not expecting it, you might think maybe there's something wrong with your male, or he's injured, or, you know, it's just a little bit jarring if you haven't seen this before. So several times in the last few months, I've thought that the animals weren't mating, and I've gone to try to separate them to clean cages, and it turns out they were mating. And of course, the male has his hemipene inserted, and the female kind of jerks away. You wonder, well, could this potentially be causing damage to my snake's hemipene? And this is something that I had been worried about in the past. However, in my experience, there hasn't been any damage when the female just pulls away suddenly. Basically, the male stops the mating, and the hemipene, like magic, just disappears back up into the tail. And it's really, you know, if, like I said, if you haven't seen this before, you might be kind of shocked by how it looks, but it just kind of folds up pretty quickly and goes back up in there. And so far in my experiences, I haven't had any issues with, you know, prolapsed hemipenes or anything like this. But of course, whenever possible, you want to be really careful not to disturb them when they're mating. So what I do and what I would recommend is you just kind of gently tap the animals if you really do need to separate them and they are apparently mating. You know, the first thing, of course, best thing would be just not to separate them when their physical contact is going on, particularly if the tails are wrapped around each other. But if you must separate them, just really gently kind of like tap around the tail. Just kind of gently nudge it just to see if the male is indeed inside the female or not. Because a lot of times he's not, and you can just gently unwrap his tail and separate them. And if they are connected like that, just leave them alone. They'll stop mating at some point, and then you can separate them. But if you do accidentally separate them and the female pulls away, in my experience, there hasn't been any issues, and the male's hemipene has just kind of retracted back up into his tail, and he's been fine. In fact, he doesn't even seem really cranky. You'd think he'd be pissed off for being interrupted in the middle of, having sex, but he doesn't seem to really bother them that much. So if you do have a male for whatever reason and the hemipene becomes prolapsed and it doesn't go back up in there, that is a big problem, and you definitely want to find a qualified reptile vet. If the hemipene is stuck out, sometimes there are ways that they can kind of massage it back up into place, but you need to find a qualified vet that knows what he or she is doing. In some cases, the hemipene will be prolapsed for so long that it's no longer functional. And unfortunately, if this is the case, the hemipene may need to be amputated. And some vets can do this. I've heard stories about people who've had this happen, and they had the surgery, and that male snake ends up being fine. In many cases, he can go on to mate with the other hemipene. It's not even going to completely affect his fertility. But you definitely want to find a qualified vet as soon as possible. But in my experience, just because the hemipene is out doesn't mean it's going to be prolapsed. When you think about it, snakes in nature, they've been able to survive, and with the anatomy that they have. And when a male snake is mating with a female snake in nature, there's got to be a lot of times where they're interrupted by a predator or some kind of disturbance. And so if the snake's hemipene was that fragile that it just kind of stopped working, if it was, interrupted like that, they probably wouldn't last very long. So luckily, nature has created, anatomy in snakes that is somewhat robust and isn't going to just, malfunction and stop working like that. The other thing that you might be worried about is when you interrupt them in mating, does this mean the breeding is not going to be successful? Well, it's pretty unlikely that one mating is the only time that they're going to mate. And if you catch them mating, chances are pretty good that they've already mated, a number of times before. And so as I mentioned, I like to put the animals together and just give them space. They're together for weeks or months. They've got plenty of opportunity to mate. And so if I do interrupt them once or twice, it's highly unlikely that that's really going to make a difference. Like that was the one time where the female was successfully the male was successfully going to inseminate the female. And so I don't really worry about it that much. In the times where I've interrupted them, basically I've separated them and just either put them back together after cleaning the cage, or they're separated for a week to feed and then they go back together. But they have plenty of other opportunities to successfully mate. So I would not worry about the fact that you've interrupted them mating once, if that's going to have any impact on your breeding. You just have to put them back together, give them their space, and let the male do his thing undisturbed. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and it gave you guys something to think about in case you ever catch your boas doing the deed. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot them my way. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.